Hey Gus, happy birthday. I know it sucks to be recovering from surgery on your special day, but why don't we go ahead and dive right back into our book? We are reading Mafia Princess, Growing Up in Sam Giancana's Family by Antoinette Giancana, and we're starting in on Chapter 2. Chapter 2, Daddy, I Love You. I was just a little over 4 years old when my father was committed to the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He had been operating an illegal whiskey still in a remote little town called Garden Prairie, Illinois, with 12 other men when Uncle Sam's revenue agent swept in and caught everyone cold. That was in February 1939. On October 16th, Sam was sentenced to 4 years and fined $3,700. Less than 10 days later, Sam left home, kissed my mother, little Bonnie, my sister, and me goodbye, and left for the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. A year later, he managed somehow to be transferred to Terre Haute, where he became prisoner number 104. I suppose the transfer from Leavenworth to Terre Haute was arranged to ease the terrible visiting hardship imposed on our family. Transportation to Kansas was rather slow from Chicago in those days, and money was scarce. I'm sure there were other reasons for the transfer, not the least of which was Sam's hatred for Leavenworth. I had a glimpse of that hatred years later. I was in school at the time, and I had just bought a book called My Six Convicts, a really amusing story about the lives of some inmates at Leavenworth. It wasn't the type of book I would normally have read, but some of my friends at school had bought it and said it was funny. One girl in particular had laughed about it in class and had read a few excerpts to me that I thought were funny, so I bought the book and brought it home. One evening I was sitting in the living room reading the book and chuckling to myself about it. At that time, I still had no idea that Sam had ever been imprisoned at Leavenworth. Sam entered the room, noticed my amusement, and asked what I found so funny. I began relating to him some of the anecdotes in the book. His friendly mood suddenly darkened, and with a rasp to his voice, he snapped, "That's enough! I don't want to hear any more. It's a lot of crap. It's a bunch of lies. There's nothing funny about that place. Leavenworth is a lousy, rotten place, and I don't want to hear any more." Sam seemed to get angrier the more he talked about it, and I didn't understand. I asked him what was the matter. "It's just a book, Dad, with a lot of funny stories," I said. "I said it's a lot of trash," he shouted. "That's not the way things really are. What the hell are you reading crap about prisons for anyway? You shouldn't be reading such books." By this time he was in a rage and stormed out of the room. I didn't realize it at the time, but he had just told me he'd been in Leavenworth and he knew what prison life was really like. He hated confinement, and life at Leavenworth and even Terre Haute had been hard and held bitter memories for him. None of that, of course, is reflected in his prison records or in the FBI documents I acquired, but those records do show that while Sam was at Terre Haute, he wrote letters to Bonnie and me. The truth is that Bonnie was not much more than a baby at that time, and I couldn't read or write. Neither of us received those letters, and until I read the FBI documents, I never knew he had written to us. I realize now that those so-called letters were really instructions sent to my home and then passed on to his criminal associates. Our home on West Lexington Street was an address that would not be suspect. Letters to his children would not be inspected or censored. What better way to give orders to criminal associates carrying on his work and following his orders? While the memory of that particular moment in time is somewhat vague, I do remember quite vividly wondering why my dad had to leave for our home for a long time and where he was going. I recall running to my mother after he had left, pulling at her dress for attention, and asking her why he left with tears running down my cheeks. "Doesn't Daddy love me anymore?" I asked, sobbing. "Is it because I've been a bad girl again?" Mother's eyes were red and teary as she looked down at me from the kitchen sink. She wiped her hands, knelt, hugged me quite hard, and assured me that Sam loved me. "Daddy's going to college," Mother explained. She paused, stroked my hair, and held my hand in hers. She looked so frail and tired. "Daddy's going to be gone for a while to learn new things. He just wants you to be a good girl and go to school and learn things so you can show him how much you've learned when he gets back." In a way, prison was a college of sorts for Sam. He certainly learned from it. It was there I found out later that Sam met the policy rackets king of Chicago's South Side, a man named Edward Jones. Jones was a black gambler who was in jail for evading taxes, and he apparently bragged about the money he and his brother had made in a racket that thrived on the pennies, nickels, and dimes of the black ghetto's poverty-stricken people. All that bragging gave Sam ideas. Ideas about using his associates, all members of the gang he grew up with, known as the 42s, to seize control of the black policy rackets. My father was not an educated man. He had only completed the 6th grade before he began hustling on the streets of Chicago. But he had an amazing grasp of simple mathematics. He memorized numbers, adding, subtracting, multiplying in his head, almost like a computer. Press the right button, and out came the right numbers for the right occasion. On the streets, it prevented police from catching him with evidence, and it was something he used to figure what he and his friends could do to increase their power and influence in the Chicago underworld if they took over that city's black policy rackets. It would later prove to be a very violent scheme, one that would result in the slaying of one of his and my dearest friends, Leonard Caifano. Sam's life began in poverty, as did the lives of so many children of immigrants. I don't offer this as an excuse for what he became. It's just a simple fact. My grandfather, Sam's father, Antonio Giangana, came to this country from Castelvetrano, Sicily, in 1905 at the age of 24 and at the height of Chicago's Italian immigrant explosion. His first wife, Antonia De Simona, followed him to America a year later in December 1906 after the birth of their first child, my late Aunt Lena. My grandparents were desperately poor and lived in a tenement in the Patch, a section west of Chicago's Loop on South Aberdeen. My aunts and uncles told me it was a poverty-stricken immigrant ghetto that mixed a bazaar-like trade in Italian food specialties, fruits and vegetables, fish and meats, flour and eggs, with the tragic struggle for survival on dirty streets and squalid living quarters where disease and death were an everyday occurrence. One of those deaths was that of Sam's mother, who died at Mary Thompson Hospital from internal bleeding caused by a miscarriage. Another was that of grandfather's second wife, Mary Leonardi Giancana, who was killed by a car in front of their home as she dashed from the stoop to grab Sam's stepbrother, Charlie, then 4 years old. Sam was 18 at the time, and I've learned from relatives and government records the very active and violent head of a street gang known as the 42s. Chicago's Bureau of Vital Statistics provided the FBI with a birth certificate reflecting the fact that my father was born May 24, 1908, under the name Guillermo Giangana. I find that interesting because we celebrated my father's birthday on June 15th, and the birth and baptismal records I have from the Holy Guardian Angel Church on West Arthington, Chicago, show my father's birth date is June 15th, 1908, under the name Momo Salvatore Giancana. As far as Dad was concerned, there was only one name he lived by unless he was in hiding, and that was Sam Momo Giancana. My father never talked about his life in the Patch or of his career with the 42s. Secrecy about his life as a criminal was a way of life for Sam. He wanted respectability for his family, and for as long as I can remember, he hid behind a facade of legitimacy and tried to keep all his children in the dark about his role in the underworld. Never once did he mention to me or my sisters that he was a mafioso. The closest he ever admitted to being engaged in criminal acts was that he was a gambler. That was it. What he did was business, and it was none of our business what that business was. What I learned about my father's youth and his treatment of his father, I learned from aunts and uncles at family gatherings. What they gave me were glimpses of Sam's past, impartially, but what I've read in records and by the media. The glimpses from my relatives are of Sam Giancana, who in the media and writers and government documents never really understood or had access to. My grandfather Giancana was an honest, hard-working immigrant, street peddler who spoke English with a thick Italian accent. He might have become a legitimately wealthy man through his labor and backbreaking toil if it hadn't been for Sam and the trouble he was constantly getting into. Grandpa dealt in the Patch, selling watermelons stacked in hay to keep them from bouncing and breaking in the horse-drawn wagon he owned. When he wasn't selling watermelons, he was carrying ice, but never once did Sam help him in his business, nor would Grandpa have wanted his help. I could still hear the musical strains of his voice as he peddled his wares on Lexington and California streets in the neighborhood where I was born, and later on South Monitor, where we moved as Sam's stature and fortunes improved. Grandpa would walk down the streets and into the narrow alleys, hollering to the tenants in the 2 and 3 flats above. "Watermelon for sale. Get a you watermelon now. Watermelons for sale. It's a fresh." And when he was carting ice in the very early morning hours, he would call out for his ice customers with the same musical quality in his voice. The ice was always covered by a canvas-like cloth to slow the melting, and Grandpa would chop it up with his ice pick with the skill of a cutting machine, carve out the right-sized block, throw a cloth over his shoulder, and hoist it up with his ice clamps to bring it to the apartments of people who needed to cool their ice boxes. Before the sun was very high in the sky, Grandpa was sold out and off peddling some fruits and vegetables. He supported Sam and all his children that way, 8 of them, 2 by his first marriage and 6 by his second, and eventually became so well known and respected that he had his own little neighborhood store. But while Grandpa was hustling to scrape pennies and nickels together by hard labor, my father was busy doing his own hustling to make a fast and easy dollar as a street thief and wheelman and enforcer, and his hustling more often than not landed him in jail. Whenever that happened, and it happened quite frequently, Grandpa would have to gather together what little money we had saved to buy a new wagon or another horse and pay it out to cover Sam's fines or his bail or some other debt he had incurred. I remember one of my aunts telling me that Sam was the apple of Grandpa's eye, the favorite son who could do no wrong, no matter what others said, no matter how many times he was arrested. And Sam was arrested more than 20 times by the time he was 18-year-old. No matter. There wasn't anything your grandfather wouldn't do for Sam, my aunt said. The police, they would arrest Sam, and they would tell Grandpa Giancana that Sam would stay behind bars until he got bail money and a lawyer. Your grandfather would get very, very upset, and he'd say, "My money, I got to get him out of the jail. He said no should be in jail. He's a good boy. I got to get him out." And get him out he would, even if it meant spending the last dollar left in the house for food. My father didn't care, my aunt said. He'd get a bawling out from Grandpa, who sometimes would even hit him on the side of the face. It didn't faze Sam. As soon as Grandpa turned his back and went to work, my father was back on the streets with his friends, stealing and robbing and burglarizing. My father was arrested under a variety of names: Giancana, Giancani, Gencani, Gincana, and even his true name, Giancana. The worst of those arrests in those early days was on September 17, 1926, when my father was indicted for murder. The indictment came as a result of my father being the wheelman for several other members of the 42s as they robbed a middle-aged barber named William Gerard. Sam's friends shot Gerard when he resisted, and Sam drove off before they escaped, but not before he had been seen by some cab drivers. Gerard died the next day, and Sam and his friends were arrested. Somehow, Grandpa raised the money to free his son, and 2 weeks later he had come up with even more money to pay for the funeral of Sam's stepmother, Mary Leonardi, when she was killed saving Charlie. My father was never tried for that murder, nor were his friends. One of the key witnesses against the teenager who had killed Gerard was shot and killed, and his wife said she was unable to identify any of those she had previously identified. Police said the witness, an Alex Burba, had received calls repeatedly from my father and his friends suggesting he shouldn't testify. After Burba died, other witnesses had memory lapses or left town. So my father continued to terrorize businessmen with his friends and fellow members of the 42s, and Grandpa continued to believe that his son was really a good boy who got in trouble because he was in bad company. Those same boys of the 42s became the nucleus of the gang with which Sam ruled Chicago long after Al Capone was dead and buried. Sam Battaglia, Felix, Milwaukee Phil, Alderiso, Marshall and Leonard Caifano, Willie Potatoes, Dodano, Rocco Potenzo, and others later terrorized all of Chicago with Sam, becoming household words in the media and familiar faces in my home before and after I was born. Grandpa suffered in other ways because of Sam. An FBI background report on my father dated April 11, 1958, quotes from an unidentified law enforcement memorandum dated July 15, 1946. That report contained a clipping from the Chicago Tribune dated September 27, 1928, concerning the bombing. This is the quote from that article. For the second time in 11 days of the ice cream plant of A.G. & Khan, 1510 Taylor Street. Following the first bombing of this place, The police surmised that it was in retaliation for the slaying of Edward Divis, West Side gangster. Sam Giancane, son of ice cream manufacturer, and Dominic Caruso, son of the old Giancane's business partner, had been mentioned in the investigation of the Divis murder, but they had never been found. The police memo quoted by the FBI report went on to say that Sam had been held for 2 days after the bombing and then released. The police memo also said that Sam was a known racketeer, that he was a candidate for the leadership of the 42 gang. The police further indicated that they suspected that Giancana had shot one Tony Russell with a shotgun a short while before, and that they were desirous of holding the prisoner until they could locate Russell. On July 25, 1954, Grandpa Giancana died, just 3 months after my mother died. It was a traumatic moment for me and for Sam. In spite of the fact that he had caused Grandma so much grief, Sam really loved the old man. To the day he died, Grandpa was and had always been a simple, wonderful, old-world Sicilian immigrant with a deep sense of honor and love of family and honesty and of generosity. With all that generosity and love, you would have thought some of the qualities would have rubbed off on my father. They didn't. The only thing Sam inherited was Grandpa's fastidiousness. Where Grandpa was very gentle and kind, Sam was always cool and calculating. Where Grandpa constantly demonstrated his love for his children and grandchildren, Sam demonstrated annoyance at our presence and a coldness that froze our emotions. Where Grandpa gave what he had out of love, Sam gave to buy you silence or salve his conscience. I recall vividly occasions where Sam would visit Grandpa and give him some money. Grandpa didn't want it, but he wouldn't insult his son even if he didn't like the way he got his money. Without Sam knowing it, Grandpa would wiggle his finger at me or at my sister Bonnie, and one of us would climb up on his lap. He would hold a finger to his lips to indicate silence and that we were sharing a secret as he slipped some of the money Sam had given him into our hands or our coat pockets. He would hug us, love us, and tell us stories. And later I would think, oh, what a wonderful world this would be for me if only Sam had been like Grandpa. Grandpa had nothing to do with the rackets or Sam's underworld businesses, but when he was waked, it seemed most of Chicago's underworld turned out to pay their respects. Theirs were the names that made politicians dance, hoodlums quake, and businessmen cower. Names like Anthony Accardo, Milwaukee Phil Adariso, Dominic Brancato, Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, Joey Gilmco, Ross Prio, and scores of others. Some came to the Ceramic Funeral Home in Cicero, Illinois. Some came to the Cermak Funeral Home in Cicero, Illinois to pay their respects. Others, many of them politicians and judges as well as hoodlums, avoided police surveillance by visiting and sitting with Sam at a nearby cocktail lounge known as Joe Korngold's. In death, as in life, Grandpa was a man of honor, not in the mafia sense of being a member of the secret criminal society, but in the literal Italian sense of being a man who had earned respect from his peers because of hard work and his deeds. I am sure that many of those in the mob who attended Grandpa's funeral did so out of deference to my father's station in the underworld, but I also know that many more came to Grandpa's wake and funeral because they respected the man even if he disapproved of them and their occupations. End of chapter 2.